Thanks for coming along tonight, where we have two speakers, Quang Luu and Sydney Nguyen, talking on the topic of Vietnamese Australians 50 years after the fall of Saigon. Now, who's going first? Have you tossed, or who's going first? He is. Okay. So Quang Luu's going first. Is that right? So he is a former diplomat, but a long time ago, because he was a consul at the South Vietnamese embassy in Canberra, right? And that's where he was, and then he went back to Vietnam, and then he was a refugee from South Vietnam, came to Australia, worked in the immigration department, and became head of SBS radio, and now is predominantly involved with the Vietnamese community in Australia, New South Wales branch. And Sydney Nguyen is I'm looking for my notes here, is a lawyer who also does community work with the Vietnamese community in Australia, working for this man here. So thanks for coming along tonight. So we're going to start with Quang Luu, and then we go to Sydney, and then we go to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first we would like to warmly welcome you in a very cold, rainy night. And we thank you very much, Dr. Gerard Henderson, the Executive Director of the Sydney Institute, and Henderson, the historian and writers and authors. We thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the Vietnamese in Australia after 50 years of the fall of Saigon. So I will try to limit myself within 15 minutes. The 30th of April 1975, always referred to as the end of the war in Vietnam, but to me it's not, because that military war was followed by many other kind of wars of vengeance, war of persecution, and war of poverty. If peace was indeed restored and reconciliation genuinely promoted, then the question is, why did the Vietnamese have to flee or try to flee in the millions of people? Vietnamese by nature is not a migrant population. In the history of Vietnam, they did move south from the north for peaceful and sometimes not peaceful expansion of territory. The earlier Vietnamese generation who came after the fall of Saigon, very, very much attached to the land, just like the indigenous Australians value the environment. As a result of lack of priority, overseas experience, and proper preparation as political refugee from a communist regime, the first generation of Vietnamese in Australia generally had to overcome cultural shock before quickly realizing their social position as a visible community, which in Australia, which was still at that time in its infancy as a community, as a multicultural society. With those barriers of successful settlement in their new homeland, the impact of traumatized sea and overland journey, personal tragedy, piracy, heavy losses of life, and the UNHCR estimated there were 300,000 to 500,000 die at sea among the 2 million people living in Vietnam. Vietnamese refugees as survivors were determined to become successful Australia settlers. They were poor in monetary terms, but perhaps rich and strong, resilient for personal achievement and collective inspiration for better Australia and a democratized Vietnam. I should hasten to say that Vietnamese community are not better nor worse compared to any other Khmer communities in Australia. The difference, though, between the two was one, for the Vietnamese, we suffer highly intensity of personal trauma, in particular the former members of the South Vietnamese Armed Forces. And two, the compact of the Vietnamese community in Australia. Over a century ago, some Vietnamese came to this country literally by accident. A French ship carrying Vietnamese workers on its way to New Caledonia had to divert its destination to a port north of Queensland due to medical reasons. That was 100 years ago. For a long time, there was no official contact between Australia and Vietnam, which was then part of the French Indochina, until a unified state of Vietnam gained independence within the French Union in 1949. It may be useful to briefly talk about the relationship between Australia and Vietnam, or state of Vietnam at the time. Basically, Australia recognized the unified state of Vietnam in early 1950, whereas Australia under Prime Minister Whitlam recognized North Vietnam, known as Democratic Republic of Vietnam, in early 1973. There's a gap more than 20 years. The important point for us is that in 1965, the Manzi government decided to help South Vietnam against the war of aggression from the North, whereas Mr. Whitlam, as leader of the ALP opposition, opposed to the war and opposed to the Australian involvement. That's a very important point, because that led to him to recognize North Vietnam in early 1973, and also refuse to accept Vietnamese refugees after the fall of Saigon. I got a bit short, I jumped to another point. In 1972, Mr. Whitlam became Prime Minister. And as I said, he recognized North Vietnam a year later. But at the time of Saigon, Mr. Whitlam refused to accept or to settle Vietnamese refugees for two reasons. One is that there was a very strong approach, démarche, by Hanoi not to accept Vietnamese refugees into Australia. And also because of Mr. Whitlam's own assessment of the new chain balance of power in Indochina. That is a foreign affairs consideration. But domestically, and this is well documented, so I just mentioned, and domestically, Mr. Whitlam refused to accept Vietnamese refugees on the basis that he believed Vietnamese refugees potentially would become voters for the conservative politics in Australia, which is totally wrong. because most Vietnamese voters now living in safe labor seat and voted labor in a great majority. I think I mentioned that to Mr. Willem when he retired. When I retired, I met him at a community function. I say, why you make that assessment? He didn't answer. Now back to the Vietnamese community again. Before 1975, there was no Vietnamese community in terms of permanent resident or settler. At the census 1976, there were 2,417 Vietnamese living in Australia. Most of them were, in fact, Vietnamese students coming here under the Colombo plan for tertiary education to become technocrats for the future of Vietnam. 5 years later, in 1981, Mr. Fraser, after the very infamous dismissal on the 11th of 1975, Malcolm Fraser became Prime Minister and changed the course of the refugee issue. So while we had only 2,417 Vietnamese living in 1976, 5 years later, that number was 49,000. And that is 12 times more than within only 5 years. And then after Malcolm Fraser came Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1983. And while he was in opposition, he shared Whitlam's stance. But when he became Prime Minister, he followed generally the Malcolm Fraser policy. So in the end, the Vietnamese community was benefit from a bipartisan policy. And by the end of 1996, that's when the UNHCR refugee program ended, according to the comprehensive plan of action by the UNHCR. There were 150,000 Vietnamese as permanent residents. That is 62 times more than in 1976. That is particularly important to mention because that was the very compact way of settling Vietnamese in Australia. And that was also a point that raised by a very famous Australian historian, Professor Geoffrey Blaney. In 1984, he raised the concern and created a debate because of his speech. And then he also published in 1984 a book called For Australia, criticizing the government for settling too quick too many Asian. That's what he used, the word Asian, but in fact he meant Vietnamese. To me, Professor Blaney, could have got a point if he did not base his warning on the basis of race. If we look back then and we look at the world now, I believe Professor Blaney could have a point, a good point, because around the world those days, the rich global north very fearful and tried to limit the uncontrolled movement of people from the poor global south. And that warning from Blaney, if had not been based on racism and raised on the basis of economic burden, then he made a good point, looking back. But it was not the case because he used racist and an argument. So after, yeah, thank you. So after 50 years, the Vietnamese community now number 330,000 people. But it's also changed in the sense that there are now, roughly speaking, 25,000 international students from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. One last point that I'd like to make, to me, because it's important to me, and that is why we can claim to have contributed and therefore contribute to the change in Australia. I'd like to point out to one particular person that I became a friend, and that is Mr. Stephen Dupois. He's the ALP member for St. George, which was already Polish. And he came to me one day, he said, "Quang, do you know that there's a bread queue in Australia on Sunday?" That was before the bánh mì, the Saigonese baguette, became a sensational street food in Australia and in the world. Now, the last point I'd like to make is that being a Vietnamese Australian, and I said earlier that we have a dream to make Australia a better one, but also to democratize Vietnam. So what I'd like to say is that at the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, Mr. Tô Lâm, again called reconciliation among different parts of Vietnam, different groups of Vietnam. I wonder whether he's serious, because what did the Communist Party do during the last 50 years? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Quang. So continuing our discussion on Vietnamese Australians 50 years after the fall of Saigon, Sydney, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining tonight. Thank you to Gerard and Anne Henderson and the Sydney Institute for the opportunity to speak tonight on such a significant anniversary this year. And of course, thank you to Mr. Quang Luu for thinking of me. I did say, no, I don't think I'm the right person to do this. But he was like, you represent the second generation of Vietnamese Australians. You're the right person to do this. So thank you for thinking of me. And it's an honor to share, to stand alongside you tonight as someone who represents the first wave of Vietnamese Australians. His journey represents just through his speech today, just he's done so much and contributed so much to the Vietnamese community. So your achievements and your contributions have paved the way for generations like mine. So tonight, I'm here to share my story as a second generation Vietnamese Australian. 30th of April, 1975 marked the end of the Vietnam War. But for the Vietnamese people, it was the beginning of a long and painful chapter. My parents were born just before the war and grew up in the beautiful city of Hue in central Vietnam, a place known for its beauty, but also one most heavily affected regions during the war. They lived through the entire war and witnessed firsthand the devastation it left behind. After the fall of Saigon, my parents described life as very poor and very bleak. They described those years as some of the hardest. There were harsh restrictions, limited freedoms, no chance to finish their schooling, few ways to earn a living, and when they did try to make a living by selling extra food on the side, they would be punished or their things would be confiscated. They had to ration food and lived in constant fear of surveillance and punish under the new communist regime. So in the late 1980s, about 12 years after the Vietnam War, my parents made the decision to flee their homeland. So they were part of the later wave of Vietnamese boat people to escape Vietnam. In the middle of the night, each carrying a small bag of belongings, they quietly said goodbye to the families and began their journey from central Vietnam to the north. My mum said that in her bag she had 2 sets of clothing, a rosary, and a few family photos. She said it was something to remember home by, something to keep her strong, as she did not know where she was going and when if she would ever return. In a group of about 10 people, they paid a smuggler and trusted them with their lives to take them out of Vietnam safely. They traveled up north through the jungle and mountain ranges near the Vietnam-China border. And along the way in the jungle, the group was ambushed by bandits holding machetes, wanting gold and money before they would let them go. Before leaving, my mum had sewn a string of gold just in the lining of her bra. She said she just had a feeling, just in case something happened, and she was right. The bandits stripped them completely naked and searched everyone and got away with some money. Luckily, the gold wasn't found. But when my dad tells me the story, he said he didn't care if they had taken all their possessions, all their gold, or all their money, just as long as the women weren't harmed. And thankfully, no one was harmed. Miraculously, they made it to China. They boarded a small fishing boat, one never meant to brave the open waters of the South China Sea. They traveled along the coast, stopping only when they desperately needed to refill food and water. Always cautious to avoid the authorities or they would be killed or sent back to Vietnam, where they would be punished. The same smuggler that had taken them through the jungle was also the person they relied on to drive the boat, who spoke Chinese and had connections on the Chinese mainland that helped them on land. So he was a very resourceful smuggler. Out at sea, it was a nightmare. The waves crashed the boat against the boat relentlessly. Water spilled in constantly, and everyone took turns scooping it out quickly as they could with buckets and with their hands. Many suffered from seasickness, vomiting over the sides, and when the storms happened, the boat would be tossed around violently. People clung to each other sobbing, certain that this was the end. My mum told me that during these moments, she didn't cry, like many around her did. Instead, she prayed with one hand holding the rosary, and she led her fate into God's hand because there was nothing else she could do in this moment. And even now, when my parents speak about their sea journey, they're in disbelief that they even survived. Somehow, they made it to Hong Kong in 1988. They spent 2 years in a detention camp, living and working, waiting for a country to accept them. Then in 1990, while my mum was heavily pregnant with me, they received news that they had been accepted to resettle in Australia. My parents arrived in Australia when they were in their late 30s, so close to the age that I am now, but with no English, no qualifications, no money, and a newborn on its way. But somehow, again, they found a way. My dad took labouring roles, anything that would support the family, and eventually both of my parents learnt to sew, and they've never stopped since. For as long as I can remember, they worked 7 days a week from morning till night. And I can still hear the sound of the sewing machine, like falling asleep to that sound, like stop. So I can hear that playing in my head because it's pretty much the sound of my childhood. Despite their long hours, they were always there for us, for me and my siblings. They did school drop-offs, pick-ups. They took us to extracurricular activities. We had weekly family movie nights. We never had much, but we never felt like we were missing anything. As we were growing up, my parents used to say to us, we don't know how to repay Australia for the kindness of giving them a new home. But they were definitely giving back. They gave back by working hard, by raising us kids, and being part of the Australian community. Collectively, with so many other Vietnamese refugees, they opened up small businesses, built strong communities, and brought life to suburbs like Cabramatta, Footscray, where multiculturalism is now celebrated. They raised us to value integrity, humility, and gratitude. And even my name, Sydney, like you asked, is named after this city. Because as they landed in Sydney, a few months later, I came popping out. Obviously, great timing. And it was their way of saying thank you. So I have a very big burden, responsibility on my shoulders. As a second-generation Vietnamese Australian, I grew up constantly navigating two worlds, two cultures, two languages, two very different sets of expectations. At home, I was raised with deeply traditional Vietnamese values, respect for the elders, humility, putting family before self, and never questioning authority. But outside, I live in a very westernized Australian society that celebrated independence, self-expression, and personal choice. In school and with friends, you were encouraged to speak up, be assertive, and chase your dreams, even when it clashed with your family's expectations. I was expected to understand both worlds and often had to be a bridge between my family and the outside world, whether I wanted to or not. It wasn't always easy, and I often felt torn from trying to be a good Vietnamese daughter at home while learning to stand up for myself in a world that rewarded confidence and self-advocacy. As I got older, I started to see how much of my parents' unspoken trauma shaped the way they raised us. They had come from a place where safety was never guaranteed, so they tried to control what they could with me. They were cautious, always saving, always preparing for the worst. They were strict, push us hard with school and work because to them, success was the only way to survive. Education meant stability and safety. It meant that we would not have to struggle the way they did. And of course, that came with pressure. I grew up feeling anxious about failure, terrified of letting them down, and ashamed when I didn't do well at school. But with time, I've come to understand that they were just doing the best they could, trying to give us everything they never had. They were figuring it out as they went, without the tools, the language, or the support to make sense of what they had been through. They went through so much so that we wouldn't have to. I've never had to live a life of fear, or flee my home, or go hungry. I've had the privilege of growing up safe with opportunities they've never dreamed of. And now I get to raise my children, I have 2 young daughters, safe, with safety, with freedom, with choice and hope for the future. Watching my parents build their lives from nothing has taught me about resilience, the grit, and about gratitude. And for many of us from my generation, we honor our parents' sacrifices, not just with our careers and our achievements, but how we live our lives, with the values we pass on to our children and the way we give back to our communities. For me, honoring that sacrifice has meant more than just working hard and getting a job. It's meant giving back to the community that I grew up in. Throughout my life, I volunteered where I've could, and I was proud to be elected the Vice President of Culture and Education for the Vietnamese Community New South Wales chapter, which is a migrant community organisation founded in 1978 by Mr. Quang Luu to help Vietnamese refugees resettle in Australia and to advocate for their needs and their rights. During that time, I've had a chance to learn more deeply about the culture and history and create events and initiatives that help preserve and celebrate us. I've worked to get young people involved to help them reconnect with their roots and feel proud of where they've come from. In that role, I got to understand how much pain the first generation still carries with them from the war and their journey here. It became clear that still many of them, like my parents, are still working through that pain. I also got to meet and work alongside many second-generation Vietnamese Australians who, like I, felt the same, proud of their background, but still trying to make sense of it all. I realized that many in our community are still struggling to understand each other, but are determined to work together to bridge that gap. This experience inspired me, and after my term in the Vietnamese community, my husband, he's sitting there, and a friend, a committee member that was also a committee member, Tu Lee, we co-founded a social enterprise focused on empowering young people to create positive social change, with particular focus in southwest Sydney, where we all grew up. It's a place that's incredibly culturally diverse, with a lot of banh mi's as Mr. Quang mentioned. And we wanted young people from the area to recognize that their upbringing gives them unique perspective and drive. We wanted them to know that you can channel your unique upbringing into anything if you can set your minds to it. And if given the chance to succeed, we believe that you have a responsibility to give back. And for us, this work has been about more than just serving the community. It's been about honouring where we came from and helping others do the same. It is in this spirit of community and remembrance that we honour the 50 years since the fall of Saigon. We honour the lives lost at sea, lost in the war, and remember those who fought and those who fled. But this anniversary isn't just about remembering, but it's also about celebration of our survival, of our resilience, and of everything the Vietnamese community have built in Australia since. From the humblest beginnings, our community has grown into one that contributes in every field, in skilled trades, business, education, medicine, the arts, and public service. And we are still growing, and we will continue to give back. And tonight, I stand here as a daughter of Vietnamese refugees, a proud Vietnamese Australian. I've come to see how powerful it is to carry two cultures, two language, and two sets of values. What once felt tension has become a deep source of strength. It keeps me grounded in where I've come from and hopeful in where I'm headed. And of course, to Australia, thank you. Thank you for opening your doors. Thank you for believing in the resilience of refugees. And thank you for giving our families the chance to begin again with hope, dignity, and belonging. We will never forget. Thank you.
So we just come back up here, and let's start with you, Quang. No, come up here. Yeah, I'll go over here. Just briefly tell us how you got here, because people think of boat people, but the Vietnamese who came to Australia, apart from about 2,000, all came with valid visas on Qantas airplane. So you're a boat person, but not with respect to this country. Just very briefly, how'd you get here?
When you talk about Vietnamese refugees, you refer to boat people. I was not a boat people. I was a basket people. Those of you who know about the sea communication between ship and shore, there was a device about 1.5 meter diameter. That's the device for fishermen to go to shore or to go from shore to ship. In desperation, I was at the foreign ministry in Saigon, and I was very grateful for the Australian embassy because they offered me, because the Whitlam would not allow any caribou to carry any Vietnamese to Bangkok, to Luu Saigon. But I was in a situation where I was offered a place to go on the 25th of April, 1975. But I didn't take it because I feel that I could not do why I'm running the department. Then Saigon fell suddenly in the 30th of April, so I was stuck, I was stranded. So with the other two, we ride a bicycle, not bicycle, ride a motorcycle to the western part of South Vietnam and convince the fishermen to bring us from shore to an island called Pulu Bang Sang at the southern part of the Gulf of Thailand. There we bought the basket, and 3 of us float out to the sea, spent 36 hours in the cold, raining, windy voyage. 5 Thai trawlers passing by, the 4th of them without taking us up. The 5th one, the last one, stopped and picked us up and brought us to Samut Sakhon in the western part of Bangkok. And then I was arrested for unauthorized entry. And finally, I used my skill to convince the policeman to allow me to Bangkok. and to get in touch with Australian fans in Canberra and return to Australia as a refugee. That's my story.
So, next up, or tell us, or just tell us briefly about your parents, where they come. Very briefly, how your parents. Just come up this way.
Okay. Oh, well, in summary from my speech, they grew up during the war. And so after the war, they were there for another decade after the war. And like I said, they then made the decision to leave. Paid smugglers, went through up from the middle to the north, China-Vietnam border, and that's where they boarded the boat. And yeah, they just were coasting along the China border, in and out for, I don't know how many weeks it was before they reached Hong Kong. And then from Hong Kong, they just kind of waited for resettlement to a country, and that's how they got here.
They were chosen by Australia.
So my mum said they had an option of choosing America or Australia, and just as random, they just chose Australia, and yay, thank you.
Going right back to the war, it's been disparaged, the Vietnam War, the American War, and it's been disparaged, the domino theory, but do you think the war was lost, but Chinese communism marching down was stopped?
Well, this is a controversial, so unsettled story. Yeah, because the Vietnam War is not an American war. The American has no territorial ambition, so you can't say that it's an American war. The communist side won the war because they were very generously supported by the Warsaw Pact, by the Soviet Union, and also by Communist China. Had in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek not lost Beijing, I don't think the Vietnamese communists could have the opportunity to be supported very, very, very generously. At the time, at the beginning of 1975, South Vietnamese did not have enough bullets, did not have enough tanks to defend itself because the US Congress stopped the assistance, whereas North Vietnam received a lot of assistance military until the end. And that's the reason why we could not defend ourselves. Regardless of what the propaganda called the war is a liberation. It's not a liberation because I was there at the time of the fall of Saigon. There was no one who took to the street to welcome the invading force. So it's not a little war liberation, it's a military occupation, in my view. Thank you.
Richard?
The time of the French occupation and colonisation of Vietnam seems to me, from a book I've read, and the terrible circumstances of the Michelin Company and the way in which rubber was collected, and it was just a shocking time from a colonial exploitation period, for what I understand. Had it not been for that history, as you were saying about Beijing just a moment ago, do you think there was any chance for the Vietnamese to have avoided the circumstances that seemed to make it almost inevitable that a communist environment was created to enable what happened in the takeover of Vietnam, North and South?
Okay.
In a sense, you can't change history, but you look at Malaya. The Malayan did not have to fight. The British gave them independence. In the same way, the non-communist Vietnamese gained independence by negotiation, and that happened in 1949. If by negotiation, Vietnam could have totally independent by 1954 when the country was divided. So I agree with you that war is cruel, war is killing people, but we are the victim, we were the victim, we're not the aggressor. Unfortunately, we lost.
Okay.
I wish so many more of Australians could understand them. I wish so many more Australians could really understand, appreciate the hardships and that your families went through to get here. But either of you or both of you, do you still have family in Vietnam, and have they any intention of coming here to join you?
Sorry, I didn't take what you say.
Do you still have family in Vietnam, and have they any intention of coming here to join you?
I tell you now the story of my life.
Sorry.
I have 3 people of my side killed in the war. I have another of my side went to the north. So my family divided. The majority in the armed forces of the South, have 3 of them killed. The one in the north survived and returned to South Vietnam after 30th of April. You know what he did? He brought rice from the north for the hungry South, because to them, the South Vietnamese are in a starvation. That the my story of during the war. You asked me whether I still have relatives in Vietnam. Yes, I do, but I don't see. To me, I don't hate the invading force, and I oppose them until now, as a matter of principle, as a matter of democratization and anti-corruption. I do not take that position because of hatred. I don't hate them, because they, at the end, they still Vietnamese and they are Vietnamese. I'm now Australian. That doesn't mean that I forget Vietnam. The Irish Australian would never forget Ireland. The Jewish Australian never forget Israel. So we are in the same situation.
Sydney, do you want to talk on this?
Oh, no, it's okay. Yes. Oh, we do. I do have family back in Vietnam. We also had family during the war, or after the war. Some came to Australia. Some were resettled in the US. But our family that are still there, I don't know if they have any intention of coming over to us. And we hope to come visit them.
Sydney, you mentioned Chu Lee in your talk, a friend of yours. I don't know if that's the candidate who stood in the seat of Fowler against Dai.
It is.
Just from both of you, 50 years on, and we have 2 Vietnamese Australians running against each other for a seat in the federal parliament. I don't know if that's occurred elsewhere or not, but what do you both feel about that? It says a lot.
I have to say I feel proud that we have 2 strong Vietnamese women that are in that position, or running for that position. And especially for Tu Le, she's a personal friend of mine, and we served the community together for a very long time. And I actually she's probably one of the most genuine, passionate person I've ever met in my life. I named my daughter after her, actually. So she because she's the same generation as me, she kind of represents what the second generation Vietnamese Australian people can do and can achieve. So it's about being genuine, being passionate, being loud, getting your voice heard, but doing it with grace. And she reflects that. And so just to see that in the last election, there were two of them out there. And I remember saying, like, who do we vote for? Because we both want two Vietnamese women to be in it. No, I just think, I think it's great that we've reached a time where there are two Asian women that are running for it. So I think it's great.
Okay, so Anne.
I just wanted to ask you, Sydney, your story about your parents leaving Vietnam is very similar to a story of two sisters that my mother took in. A widow with 7 children. Most of us had grown a bit. And they've become part of our extended family in a funny kind of way. And their story very much is like Quang Lu's story, which is the escape. But you're the generation, like their children now are in Britain and here in Melbourne, who are without that political backdrop. So how much is that absorbed in your growing up and your identity, and how much has it drifted past you and gone into the shadows?
For me, because I didn't physically experience the war and go through that. So like I mentioned that the traumas that my parents went through, it trickled down to me, and I didn't quite understand that. Trying to balance both of the worlds that I'm currently living in, the two identities. But it wasn't until I was a lot older that, and I started to learn more and ask more questions and to hear about their story, that I kind of understood why they are the way they are, and like many first generation people. And when in my role as the vice president in the Vietnamese community, I learned that yes, the pain from the first generation is very real, but the second generation Vietnamese Australians find it very difficult to relate to that pain. So every year we have an event when I was serving in the community. On the 30th of April, the first generation, second generation would all go up to Canberra, and they would do a protest in front of the Vietnamese embassy to kind of stand against about their current communist regime, and say, like, we want you to be a democratic country. And we always found it really difficult to encourage young second generation Vietnamese to come and protest with the first generation. And it wasn't about them not honouring that war, it's just that we honour it in a different way, not through physically protesting, because I think the first generation wants to see us out there protesting against the embassy and voicing that, whereas because we can't relate to that, we don't understand it in that way to honour it. So for us, the way we honour it is just through hard work.
We're pretty well near the end, so just ask you, both of you, what are you actually doing on this 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon? I mean, you're speaking at the Sydney Institute, which is pretty important. I should say, you spoke here before on your own experiences, which is in the Sydney papers online. So what are your community doing? We'll start with you, Quang, and then we'll start conclude with you.
At the anniversary of the 50 years of the fall of Saigon, I stood in front of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam embassy in Canberra, and I asked them, stop prosecuting, stop breach of human rights. We all Vietnamese, we don't have any hatred to one another, but be up to date in terms of the standard of the world today insofar as respect human rights concerned. That was and we were totally peaceful and non-violent. Because that's the benefit of being Australians in Australia. You're free to accept your view. And I value that as very, very greatly, and happy to be an Australian. But I believe that a good Australian can also be a good Vietnamese.
Sydney, what's your community doing
We're from the same community, so yes, they celebrated, or it remembered the fall of Saigon, the 50th anniversary, going up, visited the Vietnamese embassy, but also the war memorials to remember the soldiers that had fallen and those that have lost their lives. But also this year was a lot of reflection on our journey here and what we have built, and it's very inspiring and motivating for what we can expect for the future.
Many thanks.
You asked the question in what we are going to do for 50 years this year. Yes, we do. For this year, we have a celebration or commemorate the 50 years of Saigon on Friday of 24 October. On Saturday, from 10 o'clock to 10:30 in the evening, we have celebration to thank you Australia. And the third day on Sunday, 26 October, we thank you Australia, and we open for everyone, for like a senior generation to come to share her experience, for everyone to share our achievement. That's what we do in Capital Park. That's what we do. So answer the question. Thank you.
We see the most entrepreneurial person here sitting in the audience, because I was going to say that what you both forgot to mention is you're getting a publication out in October, which will be published as a book, and most people come along here flog their books. So you're on the same. So they got a book as well. So thank you for that. And Cabramatta Park, right? All right. On the 24th of October. 26 October. There's your free plug. Okay, so now I'd like to say thanks to Quang and to Sydney for two terrific speeches tonight, which will go down on in the Sydney Papers Online and on this video tonight as a record of what went on here. So you want to say something? I've lost control.
I'm sorry, because there's one thing very important to me, and I should have said. Now I must say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to pay tribute, to pay as much possible the debt that we owe to the 524 Australian servicemen and women who died to help us to stay alive. Thank you very much.